When were you born and where and so on?
I was born in 1930, May 17th, 1930, in Decatur, Illinois, which is known, Decatur is known as the soybean capital of the world. It's a city about 65,000, and always gets publicity for a wide variety of reasons relating to farming. Archer Daniels Midlands is it's their world headquarters there, so they're always getting in trouble with the government for some reason or another. And then the Caterpillar company is always having strikes somewhere around Decatur. But it's very much the heartland of the country, absolutely flat in the surrounding countryside. And that goes on mile after mile after mile. It's the great plain that was left after the huge floods of the Mississippi in times past.
I didn't know that.
And the ground is very rich as you drive from St. Louis to Decatur, heading east. And you move through the farmland, you see the corn, the growing corn, and it gets taller and taller until you reach Decatur, which is where it's at its tallest. So it's a reflection of the richness of the soil.
How long did you stay in Decatur?
Not long. I'm never quite sure of, unless I check my father's diary, of when we were in Decatur and when we weren't, because I know we lived in Elgin, Illinois, before I was in kindergarten. I started kindergarten in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but I had been taught to read primarily by my mother. So I showed up the first day in kindergarten with my Wizard of Oz book.
How old were you?
Well, that's kindergarten age, so that would be 5. Anyway, I showed up with the book to read to the class, and they sent me home, and then discussed with my parents skipping a grade or two. But my parents didn't want to do that. They thought it was better for me to be with my own age group. So I didn't go to kindergarten, and the following year I started the first grade in Decatur at the A.E. Gastman School. I had a great first grade teacher named Miss Yoakum, who thought I was wonderful, so I had a terrific year. We lived in downtown Decatur on William Street, and I actually could walk to school because it was about 3 blocks away.
Did you walk by yourself?
During the course of the year, I reached the point where I walked by myself.
And this is in Decatur where the temperature is, very cold.
Well, it can be very cold or it can be very hot. Depends on what time of the year you're talking about. But anyway, I did go to the first grade there. During the time that I was in the first grade, my mother had a terrible car accident with my grandmother Moran in the car. They were on their way from Decatur to, I think, Taylorville to visit some relatives. And a bumblebee flew in the car window, and my mother tried to swat at it and lost control of the car, ran into a concrete barrier at the side of the road, and both my mother and grandmother were taken to the hospital with broken arms, legs. My mother had a broken collarbone, and the car was totaled. It was, I think, a 1934 Plymouth, which my father's insurance had just run out on the car, so it was a complete loss. This was during the Depression, and my father was having a lot of trouble with employment. Just prior to the Depression, he and his father and brother, his brother Roy, had a company called the Price Sign Company, which had been incorporated and was making marquees for theaters, electric marquees that were the big signs outside of theaters that had the hundreds of light bulbs and extensive wiring to.
Like neon signs?
They weren't neon. They had light bulbs in them. And that company went broke because with the beginning of the Depression, theaters weren't ordering marquees. So he had become a paint foreman with the Shell Petroleum Company and worked. That's what we were doing in Minneapolis, where the kindergarten incident took place. But then he had a bad infection that he acquired from his painting experience, and that led to a dispute with the Shell company. So he was out of Shell. So he was making a living as a sign painter at the time that the accident took place. After my mother had recovered, my father had received a letter from his brother Roy, who was in Burbank, California. And Roy talked about how much opportunity there was in California. And my parents decided that California looked better than what the prospects were in Decatur. They didn't have a car. My grandfather, Price, had a Model T pickup truck that he gave to my father. It had a covered flat bed in the back, the truck bed. And we loaded our things into the Model T and set off for Southern California in, I think that would be 1937.
And you rode in?
Well, I could sit in the front seat because there was room for 3 people, or at least 2 adults and a child. But I also could climb up into the back because it was open between the seat and the, whatever you call it, the truck bed.
So the truck bed had a high roof on it, not
Yeah.
just a canvas cover.
It had a high roof, yeah. It'd be what you have with camper pickups these days. So I could lie down there in back and sleep while we were on the road.
So this was while you were in first grade?
That was at the end of first grade that we made the trip in the summer. One of the reasons to make the trip in the summer was my father had looked at the maps, and snow was an important factor on coming west, that he didn't want to be trying any of the mountain passes during any time where there would be snow. So we took a very southern route on coming out. When we set out, we got as far as Marceline, Missouri, and we had an engine breakdown. The crankshaft broke, and the car had to be towed back into town. We stayed at what were called, they were like motels, but this was before motels existed. They were cabin camps, and you could rent a small cabin, and which we did, while my father he got a garage and used a chain and pulleys and that to haul the engine out of the Model T. He got the parts from a local supply house and rebuilt the engine himself. He couldn't afford to pay for it, and he was a good jack of all trades. He had never put a crankshaft in before, but he consulted some mechanics and got some free advice, and he was able to do the rebuilding. And so we were there, I think, about 10 days.
That must have cost a lot of money, I mean, considering.
Fortunately, costs were low, but clearly it was something that hadn't been figured in the budget to pay for the extra time. But I remember having a good time in Marceline, and there was a local gambler who was a kind of local celebrity. He had money and gambled, and he took a liking to me and gave me a fox terrier. And when they'd given the dog to me, they then had to chop the tail off of the dog. That was the customary procedure, to bob the tail. So they took this little pup down behind the cabin camp and took a hatchet and I think took off his tail, and he yelped. And I was really upset at what had happened to the pup. But anyway,
Is that Mickey?
that was my dog, Mickey.
And so from then on, how old was he? He was just a little puppy?
He was a puppy, yeah.
So he went with you from then on?
He traveled the rest of the trip with us from Missouri to Southern California. My parents had to be saints, because I think I would have gotten rid of the dog somehow, but they put up with having this puppy along. And it made it a little more difficult for us to get a place to stay at night, because here we were in this Model T.
Which at that time was very old seeming, or how did it seem?
That was the kind of car that you sort of laughed at. It was old. It was made in the 1920s, and was no longer made. We were in 1937. On the road at that time, by the way, were the people who were known as the Okies and the Arkies. These were the people who were suffering from the effects of the drought and the Dust Bowl. These were really poverty-stricken people. We were having financial problems. They were just destitute. And they were dirty and dusty, and they had mattresses strapped to their roofs, and were traveling, of course, in these very, very old cars. We looked pretty good because our car was clean and everything was packed neatly, because that was my father's temperament. So, anyway, Mickey would occasionally prove a problem because we'd find a place to stay. And it wasn't easy to find these cabin camps or whatever. About the time, I remember one time, about the time we were about to sign into this one place, Mickey hit this sensitive tail against something and started yelping, and that was the end. The people didn't want us staying in this cabin camp, so so we had to find another place that night. But that would happen occasionally with Mickey because the tail was sensitive, and if he banged it wrong, it would be yelp, 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 and so. Anyway, we were on this southern route. One of the things I remember is that, Model Ts didn't have much power, so climbing mountains with a Model T was an achievement. It would get there, but it would. I remember one mountain in particular where it was just chug, 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 and the car was going very slowly. It was taking all its, 42 horsepower or whatever it was to get up this mountain. And Dad was close to doing what you had to do occasionally with a Model T if you were on a grade like that, which is you actually would back up the hill because the reverse gear was the lowest gear on the car. It was lower than first gear, so you could turn the car around and back up places that you couldn't drive up. So we were close to doing that, but finally we crested that mountain and started down the other side, so we didn't have to do that.
Hey,
So-
let's just take a break 1 second. I just want to check everything.
Okay.
Sure.
Working good and all that kind of stuff.
It's turned off right now?
No, it's turned on. That tape is rolling.
All right, we're continuing now. Just go on with the story.
So we were on Route 66, the famous Route 66, but we did one detour off 66, and I think it may have been onto something called 67, but it entered California through, I believe it was Needles. And when we hit Needles, it was very hot. This was Arizona, the Arizona-California border. And there was this agricultural station there. And during the 1930s, with all of the Okies and Arkies coming to California, California had established agricultural stations so that this was a way of keeping bugs and rodents and everything out of California. It also was a way, I think, of trying to discourage people from coming in to California. People that they felt were undesirable. But in any event, they had washing machines at this agricultural station. And all the Okies and Arkies were held up, were forced to clean up to wash their linens and whatever they were bringing along, so that when they entered the state, they were clean. We arrived and we looked clean and neat and so on, so they just waved us on through with a few questions about agriculture. Were we carrying anything or that? So anything that could bring bugs or that into the state. And we drove on in. And when we arrived in LA, I remember we came over the Cahuenga Pass. This was before there was a freeway there. The Hollywood Freeway now goes through there. But we drove over the Cahuenga Pass into Hollywood. There were certain images that I had had in Decatur that were in my mind about California. One was the orange trees, and I was somewhat disappointed when we crossed in that border station, came into California, that there weren't all these green orange trees around. There was just desert at that point. I thought, wait a minute, we can't be in California. There aren't the orange trees around. So, but we did come into Hollywood toward dusk, and we drove down, I think it was Hollywood Boulevard, because I wanted to see Hollywood. And here we were in this Model T going down Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, it had to be like the Beverly Hillbillies arriving. And I was sitting in the back looking out the back of the truck with my dog Mickey by my side. And I did notice that people were pointing at us and laughing.
Oh,
So,
really?
well, you know, you've got a Model T, and clearly this was an unusual sight.
But looking at it is one thing, laughing is another. I mean,
Uh-huh.
you noticed that.
Uh-huh. Right.
What did you feel, or what did you think they were?
Well, I thought we probably looked strange. So,
It didn't hurt you, though,
no.
although you remember it to this day.
Hmm.
Um,
So we drove on to Burbank.
What did you
And
think when you saw Hollywood, though? Was it a disappointment?
yes. Well, it wasn't quite what I thought, but remember, Hollywood Boulevard was busy, and there was traffic on it, and there were big department stores, and so it was coming close.
It was much nicer than it is now.
Nicer than it is now, and clearly it wasn't the desert out by Needles. So
So you then drove over to Burbank.
we went to Burbank, and my father got in touch with my Uncle Roy. He had a shop, sign shop, that was on, I think, Alameda or Olive, one of those streets over by where Disney is and Warner Brothers. And Gene Autry had a place around there somewhere that I was particularly conscious of that because I saw Western movies that Gene Autry was in. So I think Roy had kind of overstated the case for how good California was.
Uncle Roy.
Uncle Roy, okay.
My father's brother.
Thank you very much.
You're aware of him, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure the tape's aware of him.
Good.
He just came out of nowhere.
Well, my father had several brothers. There was Glenn, Roy, my father was the next one, and then Bob, and the youngest was Clyde. He had one sister, and her name was Lula.
Which at that point was a pretty name.
Well, I suppose so. Anyway, Uncle Roy had a wife named Pearl, who was a real mental case. But she was, because she was ultimately confined to Patton State Hospital for the criminally insane. She was considered dangerous. So
You never told me about her.
I have mentioned her, but
All right.
and she had a daughter. It was not Roy's daughter. It was her daughter by a previous marriage. Her daughter's name was Maxine, and Maxine was kind of she was an older cousin, kind of wild and etc. So anyway, Roy had a small house trailer that he had on the back of his lot and house in Burbank, and we were able to stay there while Dad was looking for work and getting settled. That didn't work too well because strictly a sleeping trailer, so my mother had to go into the kitchen of the house to do any cooking or use the ice box or whatever. So she and Pearl didn't get along, and nobody got along. And my father came up with a place for us to live, but it was a place that was totally run down. Nobody had any money at this time. This was the depth of the Depression. The Depression had started to improve. It had started in about 1930, and it had improved a bit up until 36, and then in 1937, the year we came out to California, it was renewed again. The Depression got even worse. So, at one time, almost a third of the employed people in the United States were unemployed. So, they worry about a 6 or 7% unemployment rate today. It was a 33% unemployment rate at that time. But my father got a deal where if he fixed up this house on Justin Street in Glendale, we would have free rent for a year. And so he did some sign work, and he worked on fixing that house up. First thing he did was fix up a bedroom in it and the kitchen so that we could move into it. And
What condition was the house in?
Terrible, run down. It was the sort of thing where he had to do just everything to it. The garage, for instance, was leaning to one side, so that it had to be propped up and put back in place on a foundation. The house itself was so run down that you basically had to gut it to get it back to being livable. And my father did some temporary things so that we could move into, as I say, a bedroom, and he got the kitchen working. And then he started working on the rest of the house. He would, if he had sign work to do, he would do that. If he didn't have sign work, then he would be working on the house.
How did he manage to get sign work?
I think soliciting it, that he would, I mean, he was a member of the Painters Union, and therefore he could work for contractors or he could solicit work. In Decatur, he had solicited by, going into a store, and if it looked like they had a sign that needed redoing, or that they should have signs that they could increase their business, it was like a branch of advertising. You go in and you sell the merchant on why he needs a sign.
So he would go in person to places
Yeah.
rather than go to a company or if there was.
He would do both, if he needed work, there could be a sign company that was in existence that required sign painters. So sign painting was a specific skill. It was not the same as like a house painter. That's a different thing. The sign painters were paid more because they could do lettering, fine lettering, and that. He could do, an expensive job would be gold leaf lettering that doctors had.
Where do you think he learned that skill?
He learned it from his father.
Who was an artist?
Yeah. And also did signs when he did whatever he had to get money.
And that was Austin Ship Price? Or
No, that's Austin Elmer.
Austin Elmer, okay.
Austin Ship was the father of Austin Elmer.
So do you have any artistic talent considering your father and grandfather?
Nothing with regard to painting. So
Do you think you'd be able to do lettering?
I don't think I would have a natural talent for it, although I think I could probably do it if I had to. I could have. My father was, however, very consistent about one thing. She told me later. Shall we shut down?
Okay, hold on. Okay. So regarding God,
My father felt that he was always limited in what he did in life because of the fact that he was very handy with his hands. He could do almost anything. He could be an electrician. He could be a bricklayer. He could write signs. And he felt that his tendency was always to do something himself, even if he was running like the Price Sign Company and that. He would do it himself. He deliberately didn't teach me how to do any of the things that he did. So, because his theory was that he wanted to force me to make a living by the use of my mind rather than my hands.
And it worked.
Well, I certainly don't know how to do any of the things that he did.
And who
So,
handles the electrical jobs around the house?
well, I know how to do it, but you handle it unless there's a real problem, in which case I handle it.
Oh! Thank God for you, darling.
But I think that probably was a good decision because it would have been easy when I was starting out. My first job was for $35 a week at CBS in New York. I could have made over 100 and something a week at as an electrician. And that was a huge salary difference at that time. So I even thought about it because if you have not had money, the idea of going along for more years without money and living on the edge, it's tempting to say, well, I could live pretty well if I just became an electrician.
So we're jumping a bit, but let's just.
Let's
at
not
this-
jump. That's a
Sorry.
side note, tangent.
Well, but it is an interesting point that why did you choose to take that job then instead of doing something more?
There's an obvious answer to it. You know, I mean that's not hard to figure out. So.
Okay, good.
So in continuing with California,
So
Yeah.
you were you went to Glendale and you were in this house.
We lived in that house, and
you don't recall the address or anything like that?
10 something Justin, 1016, or my father has it. So we were right across from the grade school, which was Thomas Jefferson School.
So you went to that grade school then, I presume.
Yes.
And how was that different from your old school? Or?
I entered it in the second grade, and they were behind where we were in Illinois. So that was not a challenging year.
And what did you wear for the school? The first
Well, we have the pictures where the first year everybody else is in a like t-shirt or polo shirt, and I've got a shirt and tie on. So it's clear I have just come from the east not too long before. The next year, which was the third grade, you can't tell the difference between me and the other kids. We're all dressed identically. So.
Now, does that mean that in the East you wore a shirt and tie to school?
Certainly for something like a school picture, I would wear a tie. Nobody else did. Again, I didn't do it the following year, so I had learned better. So I don't think I wore a tie daily to school in the East, but I don't know at this point. I just don't think so.
Seems unlikely.
Yeah. Let's see.
Go ahead.
Is there a question?
No, I was just saying, so you're in the house, you're going to that school.
Right. I enjoyed the school a lot. My father had trouble making a living. My mother got a job at the commissary at Warner Brothers, and she did pretty well. Not so much by salary, but from her tips. And she worked basically lunches there, so it was a kind of half-day job with an occasional night call when they'd have a late shoot or that, and they'd go in to do box lunches or whatever it was for the crew.
So she was always around when you came home from school, or?
Yeah. During that time, my father would be there or she would be there, so it didn't matter.
And you were in second and third grade.
That was the second and third grades. I think during that time, no, it wasn't during that time. I was about to deal with when my parents got married in the Catholic Church.
Right. When was that?
That's when I was 9, so it must have been
It had to be.
during that time. So, my parents met each other in, I guess, 1927 6. And my father had gone to the Bijou Theater in Decatur on probably a Saturday matinee. And my mother had gone with her friend Mildred Houlihan. It's a hard name for me to forget, so fortunately. And my parents sat next to each other in the movie theater and got acquainted and then started dating. And there was a problem in their relationship in that my mother was Catholic and he was Protestant, and she was thoroughly Catholic because her uncle owned J.J. Moran and Sons, who that was the funeral home undertaker for Decatur. All Catholics were buried by J.J. Moran and Sons. So J.J. Moran and Sons was like a branch of the church. My mother had gone to St. Teresa's Academy, which was a Catholic girls' boarding school, and her uncle had paid for that. My father, on the other hand, was from this old line Protestant family. That Protestantism, of course, was born from the fact that these were people who disliked the Catholic Church. Not much had changed in a few hundred years, certainly in the Price family. So the fact that my parents eloped in 1927 and went to Champaign, Illinois, and were married by a minister of the Christian church, that was a big unpleasant event in Decatur for the Morans and for the Prices. My grandmother read about it in the Decatur paper. Or actually, she didn't read about it. It was in the Decatur paper, and a busybody friend of hers saw it and called her. So that's how she heard. And it took many years for the relationship to become good, but there did come the day that my grandmother, whose name was Mary McConnell Moran, she had said that my father was her best son-in-law. So, and that's because he was always very helpful around her house and would do electric work or painting, or if she needed something. So.
How did the Prices feel about your mother?
Oh, they were fine about her. They just, I'd say the two families, I don't think they ever met. I think it, I mean, my grandfather was pretty accepting of people. He liked people, and he liked pretty girls, so I suspect that my mother was, quite acceptable to him. So.
What about Grandma Price? Who's the one that made you take the T off your sweater?
Oh, that was Aunt Lula. So that was years, or sometime later. Anyway, we were in Glendale, and I've got to back up a minute. I've got to say, after my parents got married, then there was a desire in the family, the Moran family, for them to get married in the church. So the Morans had some influence. They contacted the bishop in Springfield, and my mother and father and her brother, I think it was Vin, that went, my Uncle Vin, went to Springfield to see the bishop. They had a meeting with the bishop. Special dispensations were going to be worked out. They would be married in the church. The bishop then turned them over to a young priest, who my mother told me he was rude to her, insulting. She described him as having a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and wondering who this person was who had performed the wedding ceremony, this minister. He was disparaging of that. So she had red hair and a good Irish temper, and she told him where to go, and grabbed my father by the hand and stormed out of that office. And didn't go back, I think, for 12 years. The 12 years brings us back to Glendale when I was in the 3rd grade. If I have this right, I'm not quite certain. It's somewhere when we were in Glendale and I was 9 years old. They did get married in the church, and they'd worked it out with a priest in Burbank. And my father did it, I think, to make my mother feel better, and which it seemed to. However, he could not make a living in Glendale, and they discussed what should be done. My mother didn't want to go back to Decatur and be in Decatur in poverty. She had a job. She liked working at Warner Brothers. So they worked out an arrangement where my father would take me and go back and see what he could do on making a living and setting things up, and then she would come back. So
Why disrupt? Why didn't you stay with her though out here? Since you were in a school, you'd been in it for a while.
Yeah.
Why didn't you stay with her as opposed to go back with him?
she didn't make enough money to be able to afford to have a place to keep her and me. She could get a room with this friend of hers, the Jenkins, Lee Jenkins, and his wife and mother and all that they were great friends of my mother's. She could have a room in their house and pay very little for it and work it out that way. But she just didn't have the financial means to set up a house and support the two of us. So I went with Dad, and we went to Decatur. And we arrived there, and we stayed with his sister, Lula, my Aunt Lula, who had 3 daughters, Dorothy, Mary Ellen, and Patty Ann. And Dorothy was, 10 years older than I. Mary Ellen was the same age, and Patty Ann was, 3 years younger. It was during that time that this incident that you were talking about took place, because my father was trying to get sufficient work to make money, to get by, and it was very difficult. Still, the Depression was on. So he's getting a little work, but not enough to really be, able to get a place. So we were living with Aunt Lula. During that time, my mother's brother and my favorite uncle, Uncle Don Moran, had given me his St. Teresa's letter sweater, which had a big T on it. It was a white sweater with some blue. I thought this was just incredible. I loved that sweater. St. Teresa's had become a coeducational institution in the meantime. So that's how my uncle had gone to it. And he was captain of the basketball team there and on the baseball team. So that's why he had a letter sweater. So I was wearing that letter sweater around, and my Aunt Lula was disturbed. She called me in and told me that I couldn't wear that around the house because this house was also a dance studio, and she and Dorothy taught tap dancing. And she was afraid that some of her customers would be driven away because they would think that the owners of the school there were Catholic, and her customers weren't.
And that would have actually mattered?
She felt that it would matter, and I suppose it would have. Religion was a big thing at that time, and Catholics and Protestants were separate. So I really loved the sweater, and I was upset. I liked wearing it. And she had said, well, if I wanted to take the letter off it, that I could wear it. So she gave me a razor blade that I could cut the sewing of the letter off. And I was engaged in trying to do that when my father came home.
And you said you were cutting your finger or something?
Well, I was working with this razor blade, which I hadn't had much experience with.
And
So
you were 9 years old.
right. And so I'd cut my fingers, so I was getting kind of bloody there with it. And my father asked me what the hell I was doing. And I explained to him what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I didn't hear what happened, but I know he and his sister got into a terrible fight, and we moved out. So I think my father was giving her hell over it. So what he did was he found a place on the edge of town. It was Summit Drive, it was called. Somebody had built a house and had been unable to finish it. The frame and exterior were there, the interior was unfinished.
You're having an earthquake.
Yeah. And my father,
See the light?
yep,
The earthquake on film.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay, that's enough. And the one outside is
Sorry,
next to you.
because we're going to have to take a break now